All right, thank you. Appreciate that, Mark. So yeah, I started traffic control when I was 15 for a small company in a very small town in South Dakota, making sandbags, loading trucks, sweeping the shop floor, and in short order, I ended up being out on the road, traveling all over South Dakota and North Dakota, everything from pounding posts in the ground and by hand and jacking them out like a handyman and working incredible hours. I think my record in 1 week was 110 hours, which absolutely flies in the face of work zone safety, but what my parents were thinking. And then in the late 90s, I ended up here in the greater Twin Cities and worked up through being a driver, as Mark said, project management, estimating. And so in all those years, I've laid tens of thousands of feet of removable tape and pulled it back up and ran across the interstate with signs above my head countless times. I think one year we kept track when I was running the night crew. We closed 800 lanes, set up over 800 lane closures on the interstate system 1 year. So also in that time, I've seen countless DWI arrests, especially working nights. Some of those were in work zones. Countless close calls. And one night in 2004, we had set up a lane closure in St. Paul, and shortly after we had it set up, one of the workers was hit. And so he ended up being okay. Later that night, for another company, we had a setup where one of the workers fell from a bucket truck, free fell from a fully extended bucket truck and died. And more recently, I was a first responder on the scene in a work zone, just passing through, and a gal that was involved in a crash. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath. So, all of us, work zone safety and towards zero deaths, there's nothing more important. And it's not just lip service. All the discussions we have and conversations we have, decisions that we make, it's very near and dear to all of us. So, I'm representing the Northland chapter of ATSA. We're happy to host your committee at our how-to this year. And just by a quick show of hands, who's familiar with ATSA? So it's our national affiliation, the American Traffic Safety Services Association. Our temporary traffic control committee, and I'm going to kind of explain the Northland chapter of ATSA and the temporary traffic control committee. But again, I'm here on behalf of several traffic control companies, specifically in the Minnesota area. So here's what I'm going to zip through today. Everything discussed is about doing everything we can on every project to make our work zones as safe as possible, period. And then what's the problem, or the problem statement, or what are we trying to fix? A recent conversation I had, it was brought up, sometimes I drive through a work zone, and not necessarily judging, device spacing or the details of it, but it looks good and it feels right. And then other times I drive through a work zone and it looks like the proverbial bomb went off, where there's drums laying around and sandbags displaced, and it doesn't look like someone just set it up or is maintaining it. How does that happen? And so I think there's some that believe that, hey, our work zones in Minnesota, they look pretty good overall. Always room for improvement, but they look pretty good. And there's others that feel, we've devolved or degraded somewhat on maintaining our work zones and doing everything we can to make them as safe as possible. So wherever that needle hits, what we're really talking about is moving the needle today. I'm going to talk about the Northland chapter of the American Traffic Safety Services Association, so that's the Northland ATSA. I'm going to explain the different groups that are working on work zone safety. I'm going to talk specifically about our temporary traffic control committee, about our conversations when we met with consultants, many of you here in this room, and then kind of the now what. Where do we go from here into partnership opportunities? So our Northland chapter map looks a lot like your map, if I'm not mistaken. North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. This really has a Minnesota emphasis. We focused our efforts here in Minnesota for this conversation. But our Northland chapter has four primary areas of focus. One is our how-to that was brought up, so that'll be in March. If any of you have questions about that, I can help you with that, or you can find us online. Training, I'm going to talk some about that today too. And then partnering and outreach. And these are just some examples of the different groups that we've either contributed, the Northland chapter has contributed to financially and or participated in this year. Okay, now, bunch of words and some logos up here. MnDOT hosts and runs and chairs and puts together the statewide Work Zone Safety Committee. The mission is to influence the actions of those involved with work zones through the information that is shared through innovations and best practices that are identified so we can achieve safer work zones and fewer life-changing crashes. So MnDOT has representation from traffic, maintenance, construction, the districts, the safety group, and then we have law enforcement, industry, consultants, utilities, cities, counties, AGC, Federal Highway, and LTAP. So it's a big group. It meets twice a year, all day, and it's some brainstorming, it's some reporting on best practices, what's working, what's not. And then a couple years ago, we pulled out the construction part of that group. So with an area of focus on our industry, our traffic control industry. That's where MnDOT's asking, hey, what suggestions does this industry have that we could work to implement? What are concerns or areas of improvement in regarding specs, standards, guidelines? And then what are specific things that we can implement? And so an example of that is I-94. This is a 2-year project. Last year was the first year. It goes from Mountain Boulevard to 120 or Century Avenue over to St. Paul, right in front of 3M. And so at one of our meetings, MnDOT said, listen, you guys, we talk about these safety enhancements. We have yet to really do them. Let's do it. So traditionally, if someone from the traffic contractor would approach the project personnel on a MnDOT job at the pre-con and say, hey, we want to do some things, we want to try some things, the project people in the prime are trying to get the job off the ground, and it can be distracting. Who pays for it? Who needs to approve it? So we kind of backdoored it, and we worked with MnDOT construction and traffic, and we incorporated wider pavement markings, wet reflective pavement markings, wider sheeting on drums, higher grade of sheeting on barrier delineators, and sequential lighting in the tapers. And so safety signs picked up part of the tab. 3M was a huge contributor to making this happen, a lot of their products. And then MnDOT wrote a work order. So, and it happened just like that. It was evaluated. I think everyone thought these are definite improvements, and we'll likely see many of these things become the standard going forward. So then, separate from the statewide Work Zone Safety Committee, the traffic control companies in Minnesota, of which are about 9, most of which are members of ATSA. We sat down with MnDOT, all of us, and it's a check your logo at the door kind of deal. Like, we need to talk about improving work zone safety training and communication because, again, I think everyone agrees there's always room for improvement, and there's some things that we need to address. So what came out of that is we know that industry agencies need to work together, right? It can't be just one side or the other. And we want to improve our working relationships. It's not profound, but if you've never met someone and you're sitting across the table and you're trying to fix an issue or resolve a situation and you've never met, it's harder than if you've spent some time face-to-face talking about things. This next one is a big one. Being willing to hear and gain understanding of agency perspectives. On multiple occasions, our industry have thought, hey, we see the problem, we know what you need to do, whether it's an agency or whoever, we know what you need to do to fix it, and they'll say, hang on, there's a part that you don't understand, and we go, okay. So we need to slow down sometimes and make sure that we understand the whole situation. Offer specific solutions on ways to improve training, specs, and enforcement. So what that means is not just bringing up problems, but what are some things that we can do. Improve the consistency of how specs are interpreted and enforced. We feel that's a big one, and you're going to hear me talk a fair amount about consistency. And then meet with different stakeholders to share industry. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, and then I'll back up. But as we went around and met with some consultants, we were up at the Minnesota Towards Zero Deaths Conference, and some of you in this room we were talking to about the conversations that we've had. And Federal Highway came up, Arlene, and said, hey, tell us about what ATSA's doing with their conversations with consultants. So we gave her the Reader's Digest version, and she said we'd like to not only participate but be involved. So that was very exciting for us. We were able to give a brief version of our conversations to the county engineers, and very grateful for this opportunity today to give you all an update. So this is really a golden opportunity. We've got a lot of traction, a lot of support. You know, it's kind of like a shook-up pop can right now, and before we open it, we got to decide which way we're going to point it. This is kind of an illustration of how those three different groups overlap. And so again, we're all heading towards zero deaths together. Now, our temporary traffic control committee, again, made up of several traffic control companies in Minnesota. When we met, we said, listen, it was the first meeting was, I'm sure, very therapeutic for many, but it was a lot of venting and a lot of bringing up problems. And so we're like, okay, from now on, that was great. Now on, we need to focus on positive outcomes. No one wants to participate in a group that's just bringing up issues all the time. This was something that MnDOT suggested that hit home, that we need to work with prime contractors regarding communication. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today, if it's left up to the prime for their means and methods, right, then the traffic control companies need to work together with the primes. It can't be something that an agency can fix if they want to give that flexibility for project level decisions. Look at projects earlier, pre-letting. So if we call up, if it's a Friday letting and we call up on a Thursday night and say, hey, we found something, we think it's a problem, I mean, what is the project personnel supposed to do? There's no time to address that. And then another thing is we've seen that there's some of the things I'm going to talk about, they're one-timers, right? It was a specific situation on a specific job, with a specific, whether it was designer or project level person. And those one-timers are harder to address. You can go backwards and talk about it, but MnDOT said, hey, if you see reoccurring spec issues, things that are causing problems, you know, that's something we'd like to know about so we can train on that. And then lastly, meet with consultants. It was, we realized quickly, meeting with the liaison group, that we're having some good conversations. We're getting some good things done. There's some big initiatives that are being talked about, but we're really missing out on a huge piece of our design and administration in Minnesota construction if the consultants aren't included. So I'm very proud of this. I know this isn't an all-inclusive list. This took a lot of time. It took a lot of effort to meet and go through with that many different consultants, and really appreciate it. And not only did we meet with every consultant, but we didn't meet with all the people that are involved in work zone safety, design, administration, and every consultant. So it was a good start. And what we did is we introduced ourselves, and we talked real generally, hey, just to kind of key up the conversation, what factors create the ideal scenario to ensure the safest work zones? What are issues that compromise work zone safety and quality? What are examples of subpar work zones? So I think, you know, that should be pretty obvious, but we have an inadequate quantity of devices, poor quality of devices, not having the correct traffic control, and especially the whatever is needed attitude. And so specifically from their perspective, what could be done? Now, as we got through the first few, you know, we could really have this conversation in about 45 minutes. But as we started doing more and more and more, we would ask the questions, get some feedback, and then review what the ones before them had said. So by the time we got near the end, it would take 2 hours to get through all this feedback. I was somewhat surprised by how many things were said over and over and over. So obviously those are some areas that we could tackle when you're hearing the same things brought up. But then without exception, every time there was a nugget or someone would say, hey, what if this or what about that? And so we recorded all those. Long list. What I've tried to do here today is really generalize some of the feedback. Safety, obviously, and consistency. Fundamentally, when a lane closure or a road closure or whatever the work zone is, if it's set up in an urban area, here in the metro or outstate, it should look the same. If traffic control company A or traffic control company B sets it up, it should look the same. If designer X or designer Y designs a project, it should look the same. We're finding that's not always the case. And so that's a consistency issue in a lot of different areas. Another one that it just kind of is what it is traffic control is one of the last things to be planned for. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you know, you can't design the traffic control until the rest of the project has been designed. We know that. So we have this window of time in the back end, and often, as I understand, as the schedule is compressed and the finish line doesn't move, traffic control is we're scrambling to get traffic control planned for. And we see it estimating jobs and implementing jobs where it's like, there's there's pieces in here that don't make sense, or it's left up for the contractor, the traffic control guy to figure out. And it's often because of the crunch at the end. I'll talk more about that too. Better communication. I mean, obviously, anytime you're discussing areas of improvement, better communication is one of the things that come up. But that's lots of different ways, right? So it's between designers and consultants. It's between project level people and construction level. It's all different ways. Again, inconsistencies. Lots and lots and lots of feedback on the challenges of inconsistencies. Another interesting one is less is more versus more is more. So if on a project there's a very clear picture of this is what we need set up, and the specs are very prescriptive, this is what we want in addition to what the picture is showing. So this is a more situation, right? High level of detail. What the owner then loses is some flexibility. And so that kind of ties into the next one, the competing interests of flexibility and then unintended consequences. That might not be the best way to say it, but I think what we've realized is often those that are designing the project hand it off and don't ever hear about some of the challenges that happen in the field. And so there's some unintended consequences that happen that weren't even realized, and that gap isn't closed. Quality and safety versus cost, what's the correlation? It was suggested that, I guess it kind of seems like the higher the safety and the quality is on a job, that the higher the price would be. But when you think about it, often if something is somewhat vague, then a contractor has to decide between, I'm going to put some contingency in my bid in case this happens, so the cost could actually be much higher, or I didn't even know that they were going to ask for that or enforce it, and so the cost could be much lower. So we think that the more prescriptive a job is, and the better it's designed, and the better it's communicated, that you'll get the lowest responsible bid without regard to unknowns. I'm going to back up a second here. I don't know how many of you are aware of how traffic control is bid in Minnesota, right? Lump sum, of course. So every single traffic control company, or prime for that matter, we all pay the same for our labor, basically. We all pay the same for our fuel, basically. We all pay the same for when we buy a cone or a drum or a barricade, basically. So there's not really any competitive advantage to the hard costs. So additionally, how fast you can set up a lane closure, how fast you can set up a detour, how fast you can set up the phased traffic control. I mean, there's really no distinct advantage to how fast. So from a productive standpoint, it's pretty similar. So then how is the low bid determined, or what are the factors that go into it? Really, the math behind a lump sum is the quantity of devices times the duration of time plus the labor, right? That's what makes up a lump sum. So inevitably, whoever guesses or estimates the fewest amount of devices for the shortest amount of time, excuse me, and the least amount of labor is going to be low. So it somewhat flies in the face of work zone safety. Each of us are sitting there with a plan set. If you have a traffic control plan, the quantity of devices, you don't have to guess. Right? If you don't have a plan, for whatever reason, then you're 100% using history and experience to determine what your devices will be. And in the scenario where whoever commits to the least amount of quality and the least quantity of devices wins, this is where we find ourselves, I believe, with, hey, this work zone looks really good, feels really good, because let's say we're in a county that has a reputation for being very, very, very strict, right? On the enforcement side, there's not going to be any leeway for subpar maintenance of traffic control. And maybe you have a city over here where over time you've just kind of realized that it never gets brought up, okay? So what we're talking about is we have two options, really. One, the traffic control companies themselves can step up and say, we're not going to bid the least amount that we have to try to get by. We're going to do what's right, okay? In a competitive market, that's tough. The only other option really is specs and enforcement. having to be crystal clear. Not only crystal clear, this is what's going to be required, but it will be enforced. So I digress. Another suggestion was, and 8 and 9 kind of go together. Some of the things that we drove down into and talked about, every project should have, maybe we could have every project should have these 10 things or 8 things addressed checklist. So whether you're someone that's new into designing traffic control in the work zone, or maybe you have some habits that you picked up that you didn't even realize were anything other than good. If we could have a checklist, it would allow for people to say, hey, these are some things I've never been made aware of. Or have a shall, shoulds, and best practices checklist. More frequent training, more thorough and required annual training. Simply doing a better job of conforming to the Code of Federal Regulations in the design scene. I've got some slides on that. And then the big ask is, hey, can we get back together? Can we get the consultants together, and can we meet with MnDOT and have whoever it makes sense from the Northland industry so we can talk about lessons learned, best practices, opportunities for improvement, ongoing training, etc. Now, if we have a list of 300 things that we want to fix, I mean, where would we start? Well, what we need to do is prioritize that list, get some buy-in from MnDOT, and we can just start tackling these. When I presented on this at the Work Zone Safety Committee meeting, the suggestion came up, it's case studies. I think it's one thing to listen to someone ramble through this for an hour and you can kind of get the gist of it, but they said, I think it'd be very valuable if you said, okay, this is how the project was spec'd. This is how inevitably the project was bid and implemented. And then here's what happened. If we can see that case study, it'll connect some of these dots. So, Code of Federal Regulations, and I had heard of this once before, read it once before, but it didn't really sink in until it was brought up in these conversations. Now, I believe that this applies to federally funded projects specifically, but I also believe that the principles are sound. Payment for work zone traffic control features and operations shall not be incidental or included in other items. And it can be kind of a slippery slope where you're talking about work zone safety and you go right to payment, and you go right to specs, and you go right to whatever. But we think it's a direct correlation where, again, if oftentimes is the agency, is the owner getting what they're paying for? Are they not getting what they're paying for? And so I think the obstacles come to those is the traffic control industry understanding, what's required and believing that it's going to be enforced. The next one is the minimum separate items shall be provided for major categories. So let's say there was concrete barrier that might be needed on the project, right? Not sure, could be up to how the contractor does it. If it says the contractor shall provide concrete barrier, paraphrasing, if required, in conformance with the MUTCD and the drop-off guidelines and everything else, then, it may or may not get put in the bid. Maybe similarly would be message boards. Hey, we might want message boards, or we intend to use message boards. It's going to be as directed by the engineer, we'll see, and those are incidental to the lump sum, right? So those are the kinds of things that get tricky, and this will make more sense here in a second. For method-based specs, the specifications and other plans, specs, and estimate documents should provide sufficient details such that the quantity and types of devices and the overall effort to implement can be determined. Seems pretty straightforward. Lump sum should be limited to items where an actual quantity required is provided, unless it's dependent on the contractor's choice, prime's choice, for work scheduling and methodology. So maybe having here's our phased traffic control plan, right? We're showing you what's required for each stage. Now there's going to be temporary lane closures that are going to be required for this. We have no idea how many. As the designer, as the owner, I have no idea. You need to talk to your prime about that. That makes sense. Unit price payment should be provided for items over which the contractor has little or no control. That's where it would be like as required by the engineer. So the point of bringing these up is kind of where we settled in these conversations is at the same place, but none of it is like a new aha moment or profound. This guidance exists. In the MnDOT design scene, they say incidental formation only and lump sum quantities will no longer be supplied in the plan or special provisions. So it's my understanding what that means is if we have a traffic control plan, we're not going to tell you how many roadworks and barricades and cones are in this picture. You can do your own takeouts. Okay? And that's fine too. It can be quantified. It goes on to say a description of the work to be paid for as a lump sum is included in the plan so that contractors bidding on the project will know exactly what work and materials are included in the pay item. So where we struggle is when we have not only don't know exactly, we have just no clue. I mean, we're just completely randomly guessing. This is happening a lot right now in TPAR, APAR, pedestrian control, right? Everybody knows or has heard of PROAG, ADAG, ADA Act. MnDOT's done a great job giving us some pictures and some guidance, but no one knows exactly what's going to be needed. In fairness to a designer, where do you start? There's not enough history. There's not enough information to even gather at the time that you're designing a project. And so our position is, our industry's position is, since it's an almost impossible task for a designer, since it's an equally impossible task for an estimator on the construction side, what would make the most sense is to have, when you have the project personnel, the inspectors, the prime, maybe the subs that they've hired doing the work that requires pedestrian control, and the traffic control personnel all standing on the corner of the job before it's starting, or at break time, you could figure out exactly what will be required, then how do you pay for it? So if it's a lump sum, it'll never be right. Either it'll be a ballistic amount in the bid because of the unknowns, or it'll be next to nothing because, well, I've been getting away with just having sidewalk flow signs. I'm hoping that's all they want, right? But if we have items for ramps, longitudinal channelizing devices, hard surfaces, things like that, then when it's decided together what's needed, there's a way to pay for it. Either a bill of materials has been developed or has been developed for items such as standardized traffic control. Now bear with me in this paragraph. Clear definition in the plan of what's expected in each case contributes to harmony, and I would say safety, and better results in less cost. More accurate estimates are promoted as well. There's no good substitute for careful research and determination of reasonably accurate quantities. If you pursue this a bit further, occasionally a plan requires for direct payment for certain items, like lump sum traffic control. Okay? Yet it advises bidders that certain like items of an unknown quantity, let's say message boards, will be required to be furnished, but will not be measured. This can only be disadvantageous to the state or the owner, the agency, because the bidder must include an amount for that unknown quantity in their bid, and then they get to demand payment for the unknown quantity in their lump sum. Instead, if we think, hey, it might be 50 message board, I don't know, 50, sound good? Yep, okay. We might only use 20, we might use 50, we might use 70, we're only going to pay for what's used. Here's how this ties into work zone safety. I don't care if it's safety signs, warning lights, gyre, on and on down the list. If the phone rings and it's the prime contractor or it's the inspector that says, hey, I need a message board out here and I need it out here now, and it could be a message board, it could be any number of things, right? We've got something that we need to do different. If there's a pay item for it, then the traffic control guy says, no problem, we're on our way. If there's not, the first thing is, well, how does this get paid for? Right? And so then that's where some of these relationship building efforts come in, because there's arguing over, did I understand that that might be a requirement? Was that communicated that that was your intent? All of those things come into play. And even in the MnDOT's traffic control plan development course, and I think this was last 2015, I don't know if this has changed, the most recent one that they just did, but it says, plan specs and estimates shall include appropriate payment provisions for implementing the plan. Designers are encouraged to use appropriate payments to the fullest extent possible. So again, it's just yet another example of how this has all been, this is the standard. So here are some of the questions or discussion items that I think that where we can go from here. So I'll say, obviously, designing traffic control should be a top priority. Okay. There's times when there's no plans. That happens a lot. I think in general, our industry has enough experience to do a pretty good job of guessing, estimating what might be needed. But in the cases where there is no plan, the specs are boilerplate, you know, that's when we find ourselves in, and not just the devices, because I have no doubt that if we need a truckload of stuff to make this work zone safe, that there'll be a truckload of stuff out there, right? At the end of the day, one way or another, what's needed will be out there. But how about at the end of the day, making sure that looks like it did when it was first set up? How about after a windstorm goes through, right? Now that's not the agency's responsibility to be out there maintaining and servicing the job. Between the prime and the traffic control sub, it's 100% our responsibility. If we understand that as an industry that's how it has to be, you know, we'll raise that bar. If it's not enforced, then it starts slipping. I am still, I mean, I get it, but I'm still confused why unquantifiable items are ever allowed to be made incidental. I think it's an unintended consequence. You know, we an agency, we're trying to do less with more. I don't want to have to count all this stuff. I don't want to have to measure all this stuff, you know. But it was said, meeting with some of the consultants, that's the job. And if you make a bunch of things incidental and they're not quantifiable, there's no way it's ever going to be right. You're not going to have out there what you need. You're going to pay for something you don't get. Or you're going to get for something you don't pay for. Case studies, we know that that'll be helpful. And that'll take some work, but we're going to do that. And then when you think about the inconsistencies in the design, plan, and bid, you know, and think about in the metro, right, from one resident engineer office to another, or within all of MnDOT, from one district to another. It can be night and day what their expectations or requirements are, how they do it. And then not just within MnDOT, but from one city to another county, or one county to MnDOT. Is it even possible to have statewide and agency-wide consistency? I'd like to think so. You know, if we settle on no, it's not possible. We want that flexibility of allowing engineers to use their own discretion. Then let's not put a lot of energy into that if it's not possible. But if it is, let's tackle it. Industry's part, prime and traffic control subs. You know, there may only be 9 traffic control companies, you know, but there's who knows how many hundreds of prime contractors, thousands. And so the number of groups that need to get on the same page there is equally challenging, but that's on us. And then recently it was brought up, what about the smaller companies that aren't that don't belong to ATSA and aren't hearing these conversations and don't come to the meetings? Or what about the utility companies? You know, and some of them are great, and they use traffic control companies, but others grab 3 cones if they have that or whatever and throw it out. So I think that goes back to training. MnDOT years ago, 15 plus years ago, developed their own traffic control supervisor class. And so it's a really good class. It really, really is. But it's based primarily around MnDOT's 1404 and 2563 specification. So as much as any discussion about taper lengths and spacing and whatnot, you're going to hear about what the spec means and how to meet its requirements. Often, contractors, utility companies, agency personnel will go to that class because when you search, hey, traffic control Minnesota training, that comes up. And MnDOT's hearing often that people are leaving there feeling like, that's not what we thought it was going to be. So ATSA, and I'm not selling ATSA training, but ATSA has phenomenal training. And it's about the fundamentals. So whether it's traffic control supervisor, where you understand the fundamentals of setting up traffic control and the liability that you need to recognize as part of doing it right, we think that MnDOT might consider having an ATSA type or LTAP type training be a prerequisite to the traffic control supervisor class. So then maybe it's someone who hasn't had some traffic control fundamental training in a long time, or maybe it's a new engineer, that if they get to some of that, the utility companies would send their people there. We think that might help. That ties into how the current training offerings may be contributing. I think we need to do a better job of making that training. When the classes come out, whether it is ATSA or MnDOT, they fill up like that. So obviously the need is there. I think we need to offer more training. And then the Northland Industry Consultant Representatives and MnDOT to meet and discuss the feedback, share perspectives, prioritize, and work towards improving. I'm going to come back to that. I do want to thank MnDOT. You know, they made time for us and welcomed us in, right? And these same folks in construction and traffic, this isn't all they're working on. It's a very probably small piece of it. None more important, but it's a small piece of what they're working on. And so, you know, they've given not just lip service, but they're, you know, pounding on the table saying, hey, let's do this. And it gives a lot of credibility when, you know, we need them there when our industry meets, right? And we need their support for the specific situations on the job, whether it's safety enhancements or issues that we're resolving. And they really, really have been supportive and taking the lead on this. So we're very appreciative of that relationship. And then again, kind of how I started, let's work together. So we're doing everything we can on every project to make our work zones as safe as possible. Last December, I gave an update on this at the State Work Zone Safety Committee meeting. And then it's my understanding that in January, the county engineers talked about how we can communicate with them directly so they're not getting left out of this. We have this today. In March, we'll have I'll get down into some of the details. I'll do a breakout session at our how-to. And then the spring or the summer, and we think it needs to be a facilitated meeting. There could likely be over 100 different consultants, representatives there, not to mention the different groups from MnDOT in our industry. And, you know, start picking through this. Where do we start? What are the priority issues? Maybe what are some lower hanging fruit ones so we can get some traction? So for those of you here today, if you didn't see your company's name on the list or you weren't part of those conversations, I would more than welcome the opportunity to share with you some of the details of what's been talked about and get your perspective. If, for those of you that we have met with, if there's something that is an afterthought, please don't hesitate to let me know, because we, you know, again, I talked about this being a golden opportunity. There's so much traction behind this, and it's to my knowledge, nothing like this has ever been, you know, geared up before, having all the players involved. And so we want to meet and keep this going. I've been asked on multiple occasions, hey, I've got a project that I'm putting together right now. Can I get your input, you know, on how you think maybe we could handle a situation? And we say absolutely. Training. I've also been asked a lot, hey, you know, if anything, if I had a magic wand, it would give me a class where I can understand how to estimate traffic control. So we intend to do that. And in the meantime, we're happy to take any calls and talk you through how we would look at a project. Best practices on addressing incidentals. I really do believe that if we can tackle that the quality of work zone safety is going to go up significantly. And again, provide those case studies. So we're doing, I think, very good on time. This is questions. Anything you want to add? Any questions anyone has? Yes, sir.
In your safety considerations, what emphasis we put on advanced signage, i.e., you have, let's say, the right lane that goes in construction. That sign out there says construction control and right lane codes, you get up closer to it, and all the work is now done, not done, but through the day, they curve off the side, the signs are facing away from traffic. Put that sign back there, reads this respect for sign that says it's right lane codes.
Absolutely.
So what emphasis do you put in something like that?
So that, what you're talking about, I would say is more about for our people that are out in the field and for the primes that we're working with. There's really two situations in Minnesota that happen, whether it's a utility company, a traditional construction project, maintenance, whatever it is. Either the traffic control company is fully responsible to provide the devices, set them up, maintain, and remove them, or they're more of a supplier, where the company doing the work doesn't have their own signing, and they're like, hey, bring it out the first time and set it up, and we'll take it from there, and we'll call you when we're done. So in either case, you know, I really believe and hope that if a traffic control company in Minnesota is leaving a project, they're not leaving the advanced warning signs up when they leave at the end of the day. Can it happen? sometimes are they racing out of there and they forget to knock down the advanced warning signs? I suppose. But I think when that's happening most of the time is when the prime or one of their subs or somebody other than the traffic control company is responsible for taking it down and doesn't understand the responsibility. And that's when you're seeing the signs that are left up and we lose credibility, and someone may have saw the signs up and the right lane wasn't closed, and the next time they drive through the signs are still up and the right lane isn't closed. We can have a situation because they don't know whether to believe it or not. Does that answer your question?
Pretty much. I'm just wondering about how, is that in your safety aspect of
So that's
those committees?
That's in the LTAP, ATSA, MnDOT training. It's, it's the fundamentals. Knock your advanced warning signs down when you leave.
For the that I-94 project where 3M and the industry was going to try some new things, is there any feedback that you can share with us about how things have worked or not worked as expected?
Yeah. So the sequential lighting, and just in case you're not familiar with it, there's two different companies that have, I'll call them strobe lights, and you put them on the taper devices. So they're subtle enough that it doesn't look like an airplane should land there, but it enhances the taper. And so, so as you're approaching the taper, you'll see this, sequential lighting, strobe lighting. Two different manufacturers of it. One worked awesome, and if one device if a taper barrel got bumped and knocked out of the way, it didn't mess up the system. It ignored that one that went out of range and it kept going. And if you brought that one back in, it worked again flawlessly. The other ones we had problems with. That was in a well-lit area, and so it was very subtle, even at night, and even more so during the day. That has been tested one other time, demoed one other time up near Duluth, and everyone that drove through it, saw it, evaluated it, loved it. Wider sheeting on drums. So right now in Minnesota we use a 4-inch sheeting, diamond green sheeting, and what we put out was a 6-inch sheeting, so 50% more surface area. When they're brand new and you put them out there, it's like, wow. I mean, they're hot, right? Just like a brand new sign when you put it up. It didn't take long for normal road grime and whatnot, and it calmed down. I think other than all of us traffic control companies own tens of thousands of drums, right? And we'd like to not throw away and have to buy stitches, but having more surface area for reflective sheeting seems like a no-brainer. MnDOT's working now with our industry on implementation of the new sheeting. Wet reflective pavement markings doesn't seem like it seems like a no-brainer, but to be able to see the lines when it's dark and raining, right? That's a good thing. Non-wet reflective latex paint in work zones, especially for the later that we get in the season on jobs, it's a problem. It's not good. I drove through 35E all through the Cayuga and Minpass project. I know the job inside out and upside down, and when we have changes to the geometry, it can be scary. So that was another good one. Wider pavement markings for temporary tape. I'm sure we're going to go to, MnDOT's going to go to 6-inch pavement markings in transition areas. Right, again, it's almost a negligible cost increase, and it looks significantly better, in my opinion. And then a higher grade of sheeting on barrier delineators. So we were delineating. We jumped up quite a few steps. I can't tell you if it was a type 4 or a type 11 or whatever it was, but we jumped up quite a bit. And that higher grade of sheeting made it look like a glow stick on there. Those were the specifics on that. Anything else? Really appreciate your time, and I'll leave some cards here too. Thanks so much.
We do have one more thing for you to say thank you. I hope you enjoy drinking liquids.
Nice. He does.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you in March. What did I say? People you Hello.